The pen was already moving when Elena leaned in and whispered in his ear. Rafael Moretti had tattoos across his knuckles and a jaw like a closed door, and he was 2 seconds away from signing the most dangerous piece of paper he had touched in 30 years of careful choices. The crystal chandelier above the table made everything look warm and settled and expensive, the way certain rooms are designed to stop you from thinking clearly. To his left, Victor Salazar sat completely still in his navy suit with his silver hair combed smooth and his hands folded on the table, watching the pen the way a man watches something he has waited a very long time to see happen. He was smiling. Not the kind of smile that means something is funny. The kind of smile that means something is already done. Elena was the one who should not have been there. She was 22 years old and she had come to this restaurant in a borrowed dress with nothing in her purse except her phone and a folded printout of a document that was going to cost one of the most powerful men in Miami everything he had spent 30 years building. She was nobody in that room. She knew it. Victor Salazar knew it. That was exactly why she had been able to find what nobody else had bothered to look for. She leaned close to Rafa's ear and said 4 sentences. Just 4. Her voice was so quiet that the man sitting directly beside him could not hear a single word. Victor Salazar's smile did not move. But his hand did. Now, before we go any further, if you have ever found out something important and had to choose between staying quiet and keeping yourself safe or speaking up and losing everything, this story is going to sit with you. Drop a comment right now. What would you have done in her place? Hold on to your answer because by the time the story is over, you might be surprised by how much it has changed. The room Elena walked into that night at the Palazzo Nero, Miami's most private members-only dining club, was the kind of place where the lighting had been chosen so that no one inside ever looked worried. Tables dressed in white linen. Candles that cost more per hour than most people earn in a shift. Men in suits made specifically for their bodies by people whose names the wearer would never think to mention. It was a room built to make deals feel final and safe and inevitable. It was a room where a person like Elena Virelli had no business being. She had walked in anyway, found a table with a clear line of sight to the private corner, ordered a glass of red wine she did not touch, and sat there for 40 minutes watching Rafael Moretti's tattooed hand get closer and closer to the contract in front of him while the man who had written the trap inside it kept refilling his glass and talking and smiling and waiting. She had 4 days of knowing. 4 days of running the numbers again and finding the same thing every single time. She had lost her job over those 4 days. She had been followed since Tuesday. She had come anyway, because there was no one else who knew, and because her father had told her once that the only thing worse than being in a dangerous room is being the person who saw what was coming and said nothing. Her father had been dead for 6 years. But she had not yet stopped trying to be the kind of person he would recognize. She set down the wine glass. She straightened the strap of a dress that was not hers. She stood up from the table. And somewhere across the room Victor Salazar saw her move, and the smile on his face stayed exactly where it was, because a man like Victor does not let his face tell you what his hands are already doing. She did not know if she was about to save Rafael Moretti or simply run out of time at the exact same moment he did. She only knew one thing. The pen was still moving. And she was the only person in that room who understood what it was about to touch. Elena Virelli had been paying her own bills since she was 16, which meant she had learned very early that the world does not slow down because your life just fell apart. She had learned other things too. How to eat one meal and call it 2. How to be the youngest and quietest person in every room and still be the one whose numbers were always exactly right. She had been a junior financial analyst at Salazar Group for 14 months. In those 14 months she had been spoken over in 11 presentations, had her work submitted under other people's names on 4 separate occasions, and had been told twice by her direct supervisor, a soft-handed man named Drew Castillo, that she had a strong future ahead of her as long as she learned to be more of a team player. Drew Castillo had a photograph of his 2 daughters on his desk. Elena had looked at that photograph every time he spoke to her and said nothing, because saying nothing was the skill that kept the lights on. The dress she was wearing tonight belonged to a woman named Priya, who sat 2 desks to Elena's left and who had offered it last Thursday with a warm smile and the words, "You should have something nice for the weekend." Priya did not know that by Thursday afternoon Elena no longer worked at Salazar Group. Elena had not told her. She had said thank you, taken the dress off its hanger, and walked out of the building for the last time carrying it folded over her arm like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. The Palazzo Nero was not the kind of restaurant that listed its prices. It was the kind of restaurant where the menu itself was an act of confidence, a signal that if you needed to know the cost you had already made an error in judgment by sitting down. Elena had made a reservation under a name that was not hers, paid the deposit from an account that was nearly empty, and arrived early enough to choose her table before anyone who mattered walked through the door. She had ordered the wine because a woman sitting alone without a drink is noticed and a woman sitting alone with one is furniture. The glass was still full and slightly warm and sitting in front of her like a prop in a play she was performing for an audience of one. She had told no one she was here. Not Priya. Not the one friend she still had from university. No one knew where she was, no one was expecting to hear from her, and no one would think to look for her in a room like this. She had worn the dress to look like someone who belonged here, and she would only find out later that it was Victor Salazar himself who had told Priya to offer it. Victor Salazar had not always been the most important person in Rafael Moretti's professional life. 3 years ago he was simply a name on a list of recommended advisors, referred through a mutual contact in a way that felt accidental and was not. He had arrived at their first meeting 11 minutes early, said very little, and listened to almost everything, which told Rafa something rarer than punctuality. In the years that followed, Victor had restructured 4 of Rafa's holding companies, recovered $11 million in mismanaged investments that a previous advisor had quietly buried, and flagged a tax exposure problem 6 months before it would have become a federal matter. He delivered results and waited for Rafa to notice, which Rafa always did, because Rafa was a man who had built something real out of something ugly and had learned to tell the difference between people who were useful and people who only appeared to be. That was the architecture. That was the 3 years. And the thing about architecture is that you do not see it. You only see the building it holds up. Rafa Moretti's legitimate empire covered commercial real estate across 4 Florida cities, 2 hotel properties in Tampa and Fort Lauderdale, a logistics company that had been operating cleanly for 9 years, and a charitable foundation funding youth education programs in the same Miami neighborhoods where the Moretti name had once meant something entirely different. He had built all of it deliberately and at a pace that said he understood he was not just making money but making a record. A paper trail that pointed away from what the family used to be and toward what he had decided it would become. Every contract was clean. Every auditor was legitimate. He had spent 30 years earning the right to sit at a table like the one in the Palazzo Nero and sign something without looking over his shoulder. He walked in at 8:14. Elena watched without turning her head because she did not need to. She could see it in the room. The sommelier near the far wall straightened slightly. A man at the nearest table finished his sentence faster than he had started it. 2 people near the bar shifted their weight in the same direction at the same moment without knowing they had done it. Rafa moved through the room with the particular ease of someone who has not needed to announce himself in a very long time. He reached the private corner table. Victor stood to greet him, and the warmth on Victor's face was so complete and so genuine-looking that even Elena, who knew exactly what was sitting inside the document already on that table, felt for 1/2 second the pull of it. That was what made Victor Salazar so dangerous. He did not look like someone who had spent 3 years building a trap. He looked like the only person in the room who was genuinely glad that Rafa had arrived. Marco Virelli had been Rafael Moretti's accountant for 11 years, which in that world was not simply a job title but a form of trust so complete it had its own weight. He was the kind of man who remembered the birthday of every person whose books he managed, who kept his desk so clean it looked like he was always ready to leave at a moment's notice, and who told his daughter Elena every single evening at dinner that numbers do not lie, only the people who arrange them do. He died 2 weeks after Elena's 16th birthday from a heart attack that came without warning on a Tuesday morning while he was sitting at that clean desk, and the world he left behind him was smaller than either of them had known. No savings large enough to matter. No family close enough to help. A one-bedroom apartment in Hialeah with 3 months of rent prepaid and a daughter who had just learned that the future she thought was being built for her had never been as solid as it looked. She put herself through community college working nights. Then through a state university on a partial scholarship she had applied for 6 times before it came through. Then into Salazar Group, where she had been hired as the most junior analyst on a team of 9 and had spent every one of those months doing the work quietly and correctly and waiting for the kind of opportunity that tends not to come to people who wait quietly. The opportunity that finally came was not the one she would have chosen. 4 days ago Drew Castillo had dropped a due diligence file on her desk at 4 in the afternoon and told her he needed a clean summary by 9 the following morning. She opened the file and began at the first page and moved through it with the same care she gave everything. The numbers in the main body were clean and balanced and professionally structured. The numbers in subsection 4.7c were not. She ran them once and got a result that did not match the stated terms. She ran them again. Same result. 2 hours of checking her own method before she accepted that the method was not the problem. Subsection 4.7c contained a clause that would transfer full decision-making authority over the primary holding structure to a named proxy entity after 12 months of operation under the agreement. The proxy was a shell company incorporated in Delaware 3 months ago. She looked up the incorporation documents. 1 director listed. The name was Victor Salazar. She printed the page, walked to Drew Castillo's office the following morning, and placed it on his desk. She told him what she had found in careful, specific language. Drew looked at the page for a long time. Then he looked at her with an expression she could not fully read then but understood completely now. He said she had done good work and that he would take it from here. By noon her access card had stopped working. By 2 o'clock there was a termination letter citing a restructuring of the junior analyst team. By 4 she had noticed the same gray sedan parked outside her apartment that had been outside the Salazar offices when she left. Her father had kept one photograph of himself with Rafael Moretti above his desk. In it they were both younger, standing outside a building Elena had never identified, not quite smiling but looking at the camera with the ease of 2 men who trusted each other completely. She took that photograph the night she was fired and looked at it for a long time before putting it in her bag and getting dressed to go out. She did not go to the Palazzo Nero because she thought it would work. She went because her father had spent 11 years being the person in that organization who told the truth about the numbers, and she was the only piece of him that remained. What she did not know, and would not find out until much later, was that Victor Salazar had hired her 14 months ago specifically because she was Marco Virelli's daughter, and he had been watching to see exactly how long it would take her to find what he had hidden. The contract had been on the table for 20 minutes before Elena saw the section number. She had stopped believing she would be able to see it from where she was sitting. The document was too far away and the light was warm and low and designed for atmosphere rather than reading. But then Rafa shifted in his seat and the angle of the pages changed and the top of the open section caught the candlelight in a way that made the printed numbers sharp and clear for just a moment, and Elena's stomach dropped because she knew that number the way you know the face of something that has already hurt you once. Section 4.7, subsection C. She had stared at that number for 6 hours on Monday night sitting on her apartment floor with the due diligence files spread around her in a circle. She had not missed a single word of what it said. She knew exactly what was written beneath it and exactly what it would mean the moment Rafa's signature touched the last page. Victor was talking. His voice carried the relaxed confidence of a man who was not performing comfort but genuinely felt it, because from where he was sitting everything was already decided. He was leaning slightly forward with his forearms on the table and his silver hair catching the chandelier light, explaining something about the holding structure in the kind of smooth professional language that makes complicated things sound like they have already been agreed on. Rafa listened with his head tilted slightly to one side, which was the posture of a man who trusted the person speaking. He had a pen in his right hand. Not raised yet. Just held loosely between two tattooed fingers, the way you hold something when you are almost ready to use it but are giving the other person the courtesy of finishing their sentence first. Elena realized she had picked up her wine glass without deciding to. She was holding it with both hands and the wine inside was completely still because her hands were completely still, and she understood in that moment that her stillness had changed. Earlier in the evening it had been a performance, the practiced discipline of a person who had spent years making herself small in rooms that were not built for her. This stillness was different. This was the stillness of someone who had run out of road. Victor reached across the table and turned to the final page of the document. He did it gently, the way you turn a page you have turned many times before. He said something Elena could not hear from where she was sitting. Rafa looked down at the page. His pen hand moved upward from the table by about 3 inches. Elena set down the glass. She did not make a plan. She did not go over the words she would say or calculate the cost of saying them, because she already knew the distance and she had already paid the cost 4 days ago without knowing it would come to this. The pen was still in the air when she stood up. The table behind her was still talking. She could hear the woman to her left laughing at something, a bright easy sound that belonged to a person who had come here tonight with nothing heavier than a dinner reservation, and Elena held that sound in her ears for 1 full second like the last noise of a world she was about to step away from. She thought about Drew Castillo's office. The way he had looked at her when she placed the printout on his desk and explained in careful language exactly what it meant and exactly what would happen if no one said anything. He had said, "I appreciate your attention to detail, Elena, I really do," and his voice had been so warm and so steady that she had actually felt relieved for about 4 seconds before she understood that the warmth was not for her. It was the kind of warmth you use when you have already decided something and you want the other person to leave the room still feeling good about you. By 4 o'clock her access card had stopped working. By 2 the following day there was a termination letter. She had sat in her car in the parking garage for 17 minutes reading it on her phone, and then she had driven home and put the due diligence file on the kitchen table and looked at it for a very long time. She thought about her father. The photograph on her phone, the one she had taken from a box of her mother's things the week she moved into her first apartment alone. Marco Virelli standing outside a building she did not recognize, squinting slightly into the sun, his jacket over one arm, looking like a man who was simply on his way somewhere and happened to be caught mid-step. He had not looked like someone important. He had looked like someone who was trying to do things correctly in a world that did not always make that easy. Elena had spent 6 years trying to look like that too. She was not sure until this moment whether she had come anywhere close. She was on her feet before the thought finished. The chair moved back quietly and no one at the table behind her paused their conversation, and the sommelier near the wall did not look up, and the room continued doing what the room was doing, which was being a place where everything felt smooth and settled and entirely under control. She walked toward the private corner table at the pace of someone who belonged there, not fast enough to draw attention, not slow enough to lose her nerve. She kept her eyes on Rafa's pen hand. It had not come down yet. She had enough time. She was going to have enough time. Victor Salazar looked up from the table when she was still 12 feet away, and his hand had already moved before she took her third step, and the man near the door was no longer looking at the door. She reached the table and leaned down close to Rafa's right ear and spoke quietly and without introduction, because there was no time for an introduction and because what she had to say did not need one. She told him the section number. She told him what it said. She told him the name of the shell company and the date it was incorporated and the name of the sole director. She said all of it in 11 seconds. She had counted them out in her head on the drive over. 11 seconds was how long she had calculated she would have before someone stopped her, and she used every one of them. She did not look at Victor while she spoke. She looked at the side of Rafa's face, at the stillness that came into it as she talked, the way a face goes still not from calm but from the specific concentration of a person absorbing something that is rearranging everything they thought they understood about the last 3 years. She had barely straightened up before Victor was on his feet. He did not raise his voice. That was the thing she had not fully prepared for, even though some part of her had known. She had expected anger or denial, or at minimum the flustered energy of a person caught doing something wrong. What she got instead was a smile and a measured breath and a voice that came out perfectly level, the voice of a man who had written this moment into his planning the same way he had written Section 4.7 subsection C into the contract. "Rafa," Victor said, and the warmth in his voice was extraordinary, genuine sounding in a way that made Elena's chest tighten. "This is Elena Virelli. She was a junior analyst with our firm until earlier this week." A brief pause, just long enough to feel regretful. "Unfortunately, we had to let her go as part of a restructuring. She's been having a difficult time with the transition. I'm sorry she's found her way here tonight." He said it the way a doctor explains something sad to a waiting room. Calm. Careful. Full of a concern that was entirely for Rafa and not at all, not even slightly, for Elena. The man near the door had taken 2 steps into the room. Elena felt it without seeing it, the way you feel a temperature change before you can name it. Rafa had not looked at Victor yet. He was still looking at the page in front of him, at the pen in his hand, and his expression had not changed in any way Elena could clearly read from where she was standing, which meant she could not tell if she had reached him or simply handed Victor a better story to tell. "She's been under considerable stress," Victor added gently, and glanced at Elena with an expression of such practiced sympathy that 2 people at the nearest table turned to look at her the way you look at someone who has just done something embarrassing in public. Elena stood at the edge of that table in Priya's dress with nothing in her hands and no title and no job and no one in the room who knew her name for the right reasons, and she understood then that Victor had not just prepared a sentence for this moment. He had prepared the whole night. Rafa set the pen down. He did not push it away and he did not drop it and he did not make any gesture that announced itself as a decision. He simply opened his fingers and let it rest on the table beside the contract, the way you set something down when you have decided it can wait without yet deciding what you are waiting for. It was the smallest possible action. It changed everything in the room. Victor did not stop talking. He absorbed the moment without a single break in his sentence, folding it into his explanation the way a river folds around a stone, continuing downstream as though the stone had always been part of the plan. He was moving through the holding structure clause by clause with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed not because he was nervous but because he understood that precision sounds like honesty when it is delivered at the right pace. He used words like safeguard and long-term stability and in your interest specifically, and each phrase landed with the gentle authority of something carefully chosen to feel unchosen, natural, the kind of language that makes you feel slightly foolish for ever having questioned it. Elena stood at the edge of the table and listened and felt something cold settle in her chest because Victor was good. She had known he was good in the abstract, the way you know something from a distance, but standing 3 feet from it she understood for the first time what 3 years of preparation actually sounded like when it was being used. It sounded like the truth. It sounded better than the truth. It sounded like the version of events that a reasonable person would choose if they were given both stories side by side and asked which one they believed. Rafa had still not looked at Victor. He was looking at the contract. His hands were flat on the table on either side of it, not touching it, just present near it, and his face was doing nothing Elena could use. No tension in the jaw. No narrowing of the eyes. No small physical signal of the kind that people give without knowing it when they are angry or frightened or convinced. He was simply still in the way she was beginning to understand was not absence but the opposite of it, a man giving something his complete attention while showing none of that attention on the outside. Victor finished his explanation and let a short silence sit there, the confident silence of someone who has just made a strong case and is courteous enough to let it land. He picked up his glass, drank slowly, set it back down. The gesture said, "I am not worried." The gesture said, "This conversation between professionals is nearly done." But Elena had watched Victor Salazar's hands for 14 months, and this was the first time she had ever seen one of them shake. The man near the door moved first. Not toward her, not yet, just a single step to the left that closed the angle between his position and hers in a way that would have looked like nothing to anyone not specifically watching for it. Elena was watching for it. She felt it the way you feel a door closing somewhere behind you in a building you are still trying to find your way out of. A second man she had not identified before shifted his weight near the far wall, repositioning himself with the same casual unhurriedness, and now there were 2 points of a triangle and she was standing at the third, and the geometry of it was not accidental and was not subtle to anyone who understood what they were looking at. The room did not understand what it was looking at. The room saw a young woman standing uninvited at a private table and a gracious silver-haired man handling the situation with admirable patience, and the room had already decided which of those two things was the problem. Victor turned back to Rafa and his voice dropped just slightly, the way you lower your voice when you want to signal that what you are about to say is between the two of you alone, a gesture of intimacy that Elena recognized as its opposite. "Rafa, I would never ask you to rush this," Victor said. "You know that. But I think it would be better for everyone, including this young woman, if we allowed her to leave quietly and finished our conversation in private. She's had a hard week. I don't want to make it harder." He did not look at Elena while he said it. He kept his eyes on Rafa with an expression of genuine concern so well constructed that a woman at the table nearest to them touched her companion's arm and leaned in to whisper something, and her companion nodded slowly, and both of them looked at Elena with the particular sympathy people extend to someone who is embarrassing themselves without knowing it. Elena felt the heat of it move up the back of her neck. Not shame. Something older and harder than shame. She had felt it in Drew Castillo's office when he called her a team player problem. She had felt it in every meeting where her work was presented by someone with a better title and a louder voice. It was the specific feeling of being accurately right in a room that had already agreed you were wrong, and it did not get easier the more times you felt it. It got heavier. She did not move. She stood at the edge of that table in a borrowed dress with Victor's men at 2 points of a triangle around her in a room full of strangers who had already chosen their story, and she kept her eyes on Rafa because Rafa was the only thing in the room that still had not decided. His hands were still flat on the table on either side of the contract, and the pen was still where he had set it 7 minutes ago, and he had still not looked at Victor once since Elena had leaned down and spoken 11 seconds of truth into the side of his face. That was the thing Victor had not planned for. Rafa stood up. He did not push back his chair or straighten his jacket or do any of the things people do when they stand up to make a point. He simply rose from the seat the way a building is already tall before you look at it, and the full fact of him standing in that room landed on every person in it at the same moment. He was broad across the shoulders in a way that his sitting had suggested but not fully communicated, and the tattoos across the back of his hands caught the chandelier light as he placed both fists on the table, and for one complete second the Palazzo Nero went so quiet that Elena could hear the soft jazz that had been playing under the noise of the room the entire evening as though it had just been switched on. He said one word. Not to Victor. Not to Elena. He said a name, Caruso, spoken at a normal volume toward the center of the room, and it was a name that meant nothing to Elena and apparently nothing to Victor either because Victor's expression did not change when he heard it, which told Elena that Victor's intelligence on Rafa's organization had a gap in it that Victor did not know existed. A man stood up from a table on the far side of the restaurant. He was medium height and unremarkable in every visible way, the kind of person a room full of people would struggle to describe an hour later, and he had been sitting alone with a menu and a glass of water for most of the evening in the way that certain men sit alone in public places, quietly and without restlessness, because waiting is simply part of the work. He moved toward the man near the door with the same unhurried pace he had used to stand, and Victor's man looked at him and then looked past him toward Victor, and Victor gave the smallest possible nod, and the man near the door went still. Not gone. Still. Which was its own kind of answer. Victor's composure held. The smile did not leave his face and his shoulders did not change and his breathing remained exactly as it had been. But something behind the composure had recalibrated. She could see it the way you see the moment a calculation changes inside someone's eyes before the rest of their face catches up, and she understood that Victor was not panicking but revising, running the new version of the evening against the version he had prepared for and finding the differences and deciding what each one cost him. Rafa looked at Victor for the first time since Elena had whispered at his ear. The look lasted approximately 3 seconds. It communicated nothing she could name and everything she could feel, and Victor received it without flinching because Victor was a man who had spent 3 years practicing how to receive things from Rafa Moretti without flinching. "Let her speak," Rafa said. He did not sit back down. Elena took one breath, looked at the contract on the table, and began to explain to a man she had met once in her life, when she was 11 years old and her father was still alive, exactly what had been hidden inside the agreement he had been about to sign, and she was 3 sentences in before she realized that Rafa was not watching her face. He was watching Victor's. She did not start from the beginning because the beginning was not what mattered. She started with section 4.7 subsection C, said the number clearly and without apology, and watched Rafa's eyes move to the contract and then back to her face. She told him about the proxy clause in plain language, the kind that does not require a financial background to understand, because she had learned in 14 months at Salazar Group that the people who use complicated words for simple things are usually trying to make the simple things harder to question. She said the clause would transfer primary decision-making authority over his holding company to a named proxy at the 12-month mark. She said the proxy was a shell company called Meridian Asset Solutions LLC, incorporated in Delaware 3 months ago. She said the sole director of that company was not a name he would recognize because it was not meant to be recognized. It was a layer, and beneath the layer was another layer, and at the bottom of it, documented in the incorporation filing she had photographed on her phone on Monday night while sitting on her apartment floor, was a name he would recognize very well. She said that name. She said it once, clearly, and did not look at Victor when she said it. Victor began speaking before she had fully finished her last sentence. Not over her, not loudly, but immediately, with the smooth practiced timing of a man stepping into a gap he had measured in advance. His voice was exactly as it had been all evening, warm and level and carrying the authority of someone who has not only thought about this but thought about it more carefully than anyone else in the room. "Rafa, I want to address this directly because I think it deserves a direct answer," Victor said. "The Meridian structure is a protective vehicle. It exists specifically to shield your assets from third-party litigation exposure in the event of a challenge to the holding arrangement. It is standard practice in agreements of this complexity, and I should have walked you through it more clearly before tonight. That is my failure and I take responsibility for it." He paused exactly long enough to let the words settle. What this young woman is describing as a transfer of authority is in fact a contingency mechanism that activates only under a very specific set of legal circumstances that we both know are extremely unlikely to occur. I can show you the full documentation on every aspect of this structure. I have it with me. He reached for the leather folder beside his glass with the unhurried confidence of a man who keeps his records in order because his records have nothing to hide, and Elena stood in the middle of the Palazzo Nero and felt a spike of pure cold fear, because Victor's explanation was not the explanation of a man who had been caught. It was the explanation of a man who had been waiting to give it, who had written it and refined it and timed it and now delivered it with such complete fluency that even Elena, who had spent 6 hours reading the document he was describing, felt for one horrible second the ground shift beneath her certainty. Caruso, standing near the door, had not moved since Rafa spoke his name, and his eyes had not left Victor's leather folder since Victor's hand touched it. Rafa let Victor finish. He stood through the entire explanation with his fists still resting on the table and his face giving nothing away, and when Victor reached the end of his last sentence and the supplementary documents were spread across the white linen in a neat and well-organized row, Rafa was quiet for a moment in the way that rooms go quiet just before weather changes. Then he asked his question. He did not ask about the shell company and he did not ask about the 12-month timeline and he did not ask Elena to clarify anything she had said. He looked at Victor and he asked, in a voice completely level and completely without heat, who drafted the subsection. Victor answered without hesitating. A hesitation would have cost more than the answer and Victor understood that, which was why he had the name ready, why it came out smoothly and immediately in the same professional register as everything else he had said tonight, a lawyer's name, a firm name, spoken the way you speak the name of someone you have worked with often enough that saying it requires no effort. Rafa nodded once. It was not a nod of agreement. It was the kind of nod that belongs to a person who has just received the last piece of information they were waiting for, the piece that makes every other piece sit correctly, and Elena watched it happen and understood it before she could have explained why, the way you sometimes understand the end of a story 2 sentences before it arrives. The lawyer Victor named was someone Rafa knew. She did not know how she was certain of this, but she was certain of it, and she could see from the way Victor's expression moved in the 3 seconds after Rafa nodded that Victor had just become certain of it too. It was a small movement. A tightening at the outer corners of his eyes that lasted less than a second before his face reassembled itself. His mouth did not change and his posture did not change, and the hand resting near the leather folder did not move. But something behind all of those things shifted in a way that Elena had never seen on Victor Salazar's face in 14 months of watching him perform confidence in every room he entered, and she recognized it the way you recognize something you have never seen before but have always known existed. It was the specific look of a man who has run a calculation and found an answer he did not put into his model and is now running it again, hoping for a different result and already knowing he will not get one. Caruso had moved 3 steps closer to the table without Elena noticing when he did it. The man near the far wall had not moved at all, but the quality of his stillness had changed in some way she could not name but could feel, the difference between a person who is waiting and a person who has been told to wait. Victor reached for his water glass and drank from it slowly and set it back down, and his hand when it returned to the table was perfectly still, and that stillness, Elena realized, was the most frightening thing she had seen all evening, because it was not the stillness of a man who had lost and knew it. It was the stillness of a man who had lost and was already deciding what came next. The parking structure was 3 levels below the Palazzo Nero, and it smelled of concrete and car exhaust and the particular coldness of underground spaces that never fully warm up regardless of the season, and Elena stood next to her car with her keys in her hand and watched her fingers shake and did not try to stop them. She had held them still for 4 hours, through the restaurant and the table and Victor's explanation and Rafa's single nod, and through the moment afterward when the evening had ended not with a confrontation but with a quiet and terrible efficiency she had not fully understood while it was happening and understood completely now that she was alone. The shaking was not fear. It was the body doing what it had not been allowed to do while there was still something that needed doing, and she recognized it for what it was and let it happen because there was no one here to perform composure for. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from a number she did not have saved. She was looking at them when she became aware of the man standing at the rear corner of her car. He was not Victor's man. She knew that immediately and could not have explained how she knew it except that Victor's men moved like people managing a situation and this man stood like a person who had already resolved one. He held out a phone toward her without speaking, and she took it because the alternative was to get into her car and drive away from the only person tonight who had stood up when it mattered, and she found she was not able to do that. Rafa's voice on the other end was exactly as it had been at the table. Controlled, unhurried, taking up only the space it needed. "Are you all right?" It was not quite a question in the way he said it. It was the opening of an accounting. "Yes," she said. A short pause. "I would like to speak with you in person, if you're willing." "Not tonight." She noticed the word willing the same way she had noticed everything else about Rafael Moretti this evening, with the part of her brain trained for 14 months to catch the precise meaning inside carefully chosen language. Willing meant she had a choice. Willing meant he understood that she had already spent one evening doing something she had not been asked to do, and he was not going to assume her time belonged to him. "Yes," she said again, and meant something different by it than she had the first time. 3 days later she sat at a kitchen table in a house in Coral Gables that belonged to a woman named Rosa, Rafa's younger sister, who had brought them both coffee without being asked and then left the room with the tactful quietness of someone who understood exactly what kind of conversation required her absence and was not offended by it. The kitchen was warm and ordinary and smelled of something baked earlier in the day, and it was so completely unlike the Palazzo Nero that Elena felt the distance between the 2 rooms like a physical thing. Rafa did not ask about Victor. He did not ask about the contract or the clause or the shell company or what she intended to do with the documents still saved on her phone. He folded his large tattooed hands on the table and he asked her what she remembered about her father, and the question arrived so far outside what she had prepared herself for that she answered it before she decided to, honestly and without the performance of composure she had been using as armor since she was 16 years old. And somewhere in the middle of the second thing she said she realized her voice had changed in a way she could not take back and did not want to. He listened the way people listen when they are not waiting for their turn to speak. When she finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said that Marco Virelli was the most honest person he had ever had in his organization, and that honesty in his world had always been expensive, and that he had never stopped knowing it. He slid an envelope across the table. He did not explain it. He said she did not have to open it now, and she did not. She put it in her bag and thanked Rosa on the way out and drove home through the Miami night with the envelope on the passenger seat and the radio off and the windows down, and she did not open it until she was sitting at her own kitchen table with the overhead light on and the rest of the apartment dark around her. Her father's name was in the first line of the letter. Not as a reference, not as a credential. As a reason. The number on the card beneath the letter was real and the word legitimate appeared in the first sentence describing it, and the position it was attached to had a title and a start date and required exactly the kind of attention to detail that notices a buried proxy clause in a 40-page document. And Elena sat with all of it spread on the table in front of her in the quiet of her own kitchen at 11 o'clock at night and did not perform anything for anyone because there was no one there to perform for and nothing left that needed containing. She had walked into a room no one had invited her into and she had told the truth, and it had cost her exactly what she had known it would cost her, and she had done it anyway, and her father's name was in the first line of a letter from a man who had known him, and the stillness that settled over her at that kitchen table was not the stillness she had been carrying for 6 years. It was the first new thing she had felt in a very long time. 6 months later Elena was sitting at a conference table on the 14th floor of the Moretti Foundation's Brickell office when the intern brought her the discrepancy. His name was Joel, he was 20 years old, and he had the particular careful energy of someone who has found something they are not sure they were supposed to find and is trying to decide whether saying so will cost them more than staying quiet. He set a single printed page on the table in front of her and pointed to a line item in the third column and said he had run the numbers 4 times and kept getting the same result, and he was probably wrong, but he thought someone should know. His hand when he pulled it back from the page was not entirely steady. Elena looked at the page. She looked at the number. She looked at Joel, who was watching her face the way junior people watch the faces of people above them when they have just said something that might have been a mistake, reading for the earliest possible signal of whether they are about to be thanked or dismissed, because the gap between those two things determines whether they ever say anything again. She said, "You are not wrong." She said, "Sit down." She said, "Walk me through exactly how you found it, from the beginning, and do not leave anything out." Joel sat down. The steadiness came back into his hands before he finished his first sentence. Some doors only open from the inside, and the only way to know which one's there is to have stood on the outside of one long enough to understand what it costs a person to knock. If this story stayed with you, share it with one person who needs it today. And if you want more stories like this one, like this video, leave a comment below, and subscribe to Arden Tells Tales. We put out a new story every week, and we are glad you are here.